put something into a radio, we put in transmit frequency, a receive frequency, maybe a PL tone, or in this case, a RAN code because it is digital, and we expect it to work. Well, it will, but only up to a point. So while we have our frequencies laid out, maybe in an Excel spreadsheet or on a sheet of paper of some sort, that's really not the place we want to start when you're creating a programming profile for an NXDN radio. So we're going to talk a little bit about the programming software, where you start, how you get it all in there so that it works and it makes sense for you. So we're going to step over here to our computer, and I'm going to show you and use the programming software for the F2100 series, which also programs Icom's F1100 series VHF NXDN portables. And the structure and what we're about to go through works not only for the F1100 and 2100 series, but it works for all of Icom's second generation radios. So what we're going to do here works across the board. And in fact, we're going to show you a couple of shortcuts here that will make life really easy for you, particularly if you're having to program radios. Let's say you've got an F2100, your friend has got an F4400, and maybe somebody that you know nearby has got an F62 radio. These are three different models, three different pieces of programming software, but there are some things in common. And the first thing we're going to show you is not where you program all the frequencies or the zones. We're going to show you the call list. The call list is the most important part of all of this because this is where you define your talk groups and your individual IDs. You recall this morning we said that every radio has to have an individual ID. Somebody might say, well, okay, I'm going to apply to radioid.net and they're going to give me an NXDN ID. What happens if I have more than one radio? Well, what can happen if you intend to use two of your radios with the same ID is you're going to get a lot of nothing. You will not be able to talk with those radios to yourself. Each radio has to have a unique identity. So maybe the first place to start is you need more than one ID. So if you've got two radios, you've got a mobile, you've got a portable, and you want to be able to use them together, you're going to need two separate IDs. Okay? Now, where do you put all of this information? It goes into a structure called the call list. And to highlight that, I'm going to collapse our memory channel and show the call list there where our person is kind of bouncing around. That's in the left-hand side of the programming software. And you'll notice under call list that there is a secondary call list, which is now displayed full screen on the rest of our display. In the call list, you define your groups, and a group is a talk group. It's a collection, it's a logical ordering of many different things. It's a container. You give it a name in the left-hand column. In the call type, it's either going to be an IND, which is an individual ID, or a group ID, sometimes known as a TGID, as in talk group ID. So we've got some of these talk groups listed here on our call list, and Florida, as an example, is our sort of master talk group ID for the state of Florida. It is a group and it has a number of 1,200. We've got some other groups in there, individual talk group IDs for Sarasota, Manatee, Charlotte County. We've got another one in there called WCF-SEC. That is a talk group ID for the West Central Florida section, which is 1201. And ultimately, as the NXDN network grows around the state of Florida, we have provisions to add in talk group IDs for the North Florida section and for the South Florida section. We can also slice and dice the state of Florida up in even more granularity, so that if we want to bring other logical groups of people together with their own ID, we can do that. For example, here in the central part of the state, even though it's not all West Central Florida, we might decide that there is really a need for a talk group that brings the Tampa Bay area together with the Orlando area, together with, let's say, the Melbourne area and the Daytona Beach area. Well, what do those four areas in general have in common? Anybody? Huh? Well, what do they have in common? I-4. And let's say we wanted to create another talk group that, let's say, includes the Tampa Bay area, the Bradenton area, Sarasota area, maybe even even Charlotte County, and maybe even all the way down to Fort Myers and Naples. Well, we could create a talk group called 1275, with I-75 being the common denominator. You could do the same thing along the I-10 corridor, the I-95 corridor, maybe even the US 27 corridor. Again, you're limited by your creativity and the number of IDs that you want to put into the call list. Now, the call list, unlike the earlier first generation radios where you had one table for individual IDs and a second table for talk group IDs, the call list now brings all of that information together into one container. We mentioned earlier this morning that we've created 4 tactical talk groups called WCF1 through WCF4, so that for the next Hurricane Ian, God forbid that ever happen again, but whatever the next emergency is, that if we need to address smaller areas and put them into a dynamic tactical talk group, that we already have that created not only in the radio, but also in our NX core infrastructure. So you'll notice that lower in the screen, we have our 4 WCF 1 through 4 talk groups defined. Their talk group IDs 1230, 1231, 1232, 1233. If we need to add more at some point, we can simply add them to the call list. If we want to add tactical talk groups, as an example, for North Florida and South Florida, we can also add those as they are defined and needed. Again, this is a dynamic tool, but it also serves as the foundation for what we're going to program into this radio. Now, here's the really best part of working with the call list. We're all human. We are all prone to making typographical errors. So when you're working with the call list for your F2100, you want to make sure that when you go to the F4400 or the F62 or any of their subsequent mobile radios like the F6400, that you're not having to type this in 3 or 4 or a dozen times. Wouldn't it be great if we could put all of this base foundation information into one call list and share it amongst the other programming tools that are out there? Well, in fact, that is the big difference, or one of the big differences between NXDN Generation 1 and NXDN Generation 2. With the first generation radios, you had to do a lot of typing. And as you went from one radio platform and piece of software to another, you could not just copy and paste. It was a lot of typing. There was no way to import the information that's contained now in the unified call list. With generation 2, once you have your call list complete, and of course you've gone in and looked for typographical errors, miscues, misnumbers, and what have you, you can then go up to the file menu, pull that down, and notice that there is an item here about halfway down called Call List Data. And if you scroll to the right, notice that you have an import and an export feature. So once you have created the master call list in any one of these programming software tools, for the 2100, the 4400, the 62, their mobile counterparts, you can then share that master call list data without having to make any additional typographical errors by exporting the original, the master, and then going to your next piece of programming software and importing the call list. This has taken a lot of the busy work out of creating programming for your NXDN radio. Super easy to do, and it saves just a tremendous amount of time. Okay, so now we have the call list created. We have our talk groups. We have our individual IDs. And by the way, the reason you put the individual IDs into the call list is twofold. Number one, with NXDN, you have the ability to place individual calls. So if I'm going to call Bill, I need to know what Bill's ID number is. And because I'm not a computer, well, I do have an affinity for remembering numbers, but because I'm not a computer, I remember Bill's name, not his ID number. Although it's 4032, right? 4203, yes. See, got it messed up already. But I remember Bill N4NOA. So with that information in there, I now have the ability at some point when the radio is completely programmed to make an individual call by finding Bill's listing in the call list, selecting it, and pressing push to talk. It's how to make a difficult job simple. All right, so we've got the ability to export, and then once we go to our other radios, we can simply import the call list, not have to retype it. All right, in the first generation radios, when you put in your talk group ID, that's basically about all you had to do. Because when you get to actually programming a channel, then at that point, you simply would pull down a list of talk group IDs, select it, and you're done. And that particular memory channel would be programmed to use that talk group ID by default. With the new second generation radios, there's another step, and it's called creating a digital profile. So to do that, we open up our digital group, we go to conventional, and we go to profile. Now, all this is a collection of individual IDs and talk group IDs. Along the left-hand side of the list here, notice we have list numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember that because that's the actual profile ID number. But if we wanted to create a digital profile, and I'm going to pull this down for WCF1, the talk group. So the talk group ID is 1230, but, and we selected that. There we go. the profile for WCF1, when we actually go to create our memory channels, will be profile 2. Okay, we can always go back and reference that. It's a lot to remember, and particularly as you make more profiles. But that is a necessary step before we actually start putting receive frequencies and transmit frequencies and RAN codes and all the rest of that stuff into the memory channel section of the radio. So call list is your first step. Digital profiles is your second step. Yes.
You have an individual who has several different radios, or you make a call group with, with all of his individual radio IDs. And so if you needed to get a hold of them, and you didn't know which radio he had with them, you know, just as I say, make a call group for that individual.
Well, unfortunately, no. Individual is what it, you know, as it is meant to be, one at a time. However, what you could do is if he's got 10 radios, you don't know which one it is, but you want to get a hold of him. If you're fortunate enough to be able to do it, create a talk group that includes all of those radios and program that talk group ID into his radio. Then you're sure to find him. But because we're hams and we all are humans, we tend to react the same way that all humans do. We tend to migrate to a repeater or a repeater system. So chances are, if you're looking for me, you're going to find me on NI4CE. And not just because of a lot of other things, but that's where I hang out. Bill, you might find Bill on the Brandon repeater or NI4CE. Daryl, you'll find him over there in, what was the name of that community you live in there in Polk County?
The emergency department. So I go to church in Wauchula.
In Wauchula, okay. Gesundheit. Anyhow, you'll find Daryl in Wauchula, and Terry, you'll find Terry in Polk County. So again, we're humans. We do have a tendency to go to one spot rather than trying to scatter ourselves across many different places. All right, so we've got our call list, our digital profiles created, or at least we think we do. So now we're ready to collapse our list here on the left-hand side and go up to the memory channel portion where we can put in all of the really important stuff, our frequencies, our repeaters, our simplex channels. Now, before we do anything else, we want to visit the zone operation section. By default, there is one zone created. It has assigned to it a default number of memory channels, 16. You can expand it or you can collapse it, depends upon what you're going to put into that zone. As far as the zones 2 through 8, they're basically just there. They're a fill in the blank, and they have 0 channels by default assigned to them. Somebody's gone in there, they've typed names, they are telling it it's a conventional type of zone or whatever. They've defined a unit ID maybe. They're telling it that they want a certain RX group setting on or off, and we'll talk about that in a second. They're defining the type of squelch they want to use in that zone. Do we want no squelch? Do we want RAN squelch, which means the radio simply filters for the correct RAN code, and RAN, which is short for random access number, acts in much the same way that a PL tone or a CTCSS tone acts with an analog radio. It is simply a filtering device. However, unlike PL and CTCSS, it is not a continuous subaudible tone. It is simply a digital value that is contained in the header packet for what it is that you're transmitting it, being it a voice stream or a message stream. And here's the rub with a RAN code. If you happen to miss that header packet and all of a sudden your radio bops in on that memory channel halfway through in the stream, and the radio doesn't open, it's because it missed the header packet. It does not know that you're transmitting a RAN of 1 and a talk group of 1,200. And so it just sits there and goes, I don't know you. And until the next header packet comes along that it does capture, and if that channel is programmed for RAN 1 and talk group 1,200, well, then it opens your squelch. This, by the way, is why you do not want to program a digital zone with the scan option, because scan is an analog tool. And with digital, it is very hit and miss. And I will tell you, more often than not, you're going to miss. You will upcut or come in the middle of a conversation rather than at the beginning of a conversation. All right, so we're going to define our zones here. We've got the first zone defined as Florida. The next one is WCF 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got a WCF section, and we've got a local zone, and then an analog zone. All right, zone types. Let's take a look at that. There's a couple of different zone types with NXDN. There is conventional, which is what the NI4CE system uses. There is something called multi-site conventional. This is where you have a fairly complex repeater system that may use the same input frequency at 4 or 5 or 10 different sites, but a different output frequency for each one of the repeaters in that particular zone. We have a couple of public safety agencies here in Florida that use NXDN. Their systems are set up that way. One of them has 6 sites, but you use the same input frequency to get into each one of the repeaters, but because it is not a simulcast system, each repeater transmits on a different frequency. And with a multi-site conventional, there are some other things that you can do with it, which leads us then to the third option here in the zone type, which is voting. Okay, if you've got, let's say, 4 repeaters and they all use the same input frequency, but they have different output frequencies, and you want the one that is closest to you because you never want to have to change channel anymore, then you would use voting. And about every 6 seconds, repeater would come out and ask, or it would send out a burst, just a piece of RF with an RF code or with a RAN code. If you are in a voting zone, your radio will be programmed to pick up the strongest of the signals that are then transmitted by those 4 repeaters. So one repeater may be received with a signal of -65, another one -74, another one -80, and the one that's way out there in the weeds is -115. Well, the radio has the programming and the intelligence in a voted system to say, of the 4 options here, which one is the strongest? -65. And if your radio is not tuned at that point to that particular channel, it will automatically change channels to reprogram your radio to pick up that particular repeater. Guess what? Our cell phones work the same way. That's how we can differentiate between being on this cell site versus this cell site versus this cell site. It's all based on received signal strength. Okay, so those are the three options that you have. Everything that we're going to talk about and do is conventional. Although at some point, I suppose we could turn on the voting feature with the NI4CE system, and that way you'd never have to touch the channel change knob on your radio ever again. It would just automatically tune your radio to the strongest, closest repeater. All right. Now, we mentioned this particular option here a moment ago called RX Group. We said using the scan function for digital channels is not a good idea. And it really isn't, because you will lose more information than you care to even think about. But there is a way to make some sense out of all of this. It's called RX Group, or Receive Group. And one of the things that the second generation radios will allow you to do is to capture, or to scan, if you will. Come on, come back. There we go. Up to 8 different talk groups on a particular repeater. Now for Florida, because that's more or less our master talk group, we probably don't need to put anything more in here or even turn it on. But if we do turn it on, we put in the value for talk group 1200. So how do we do that? We go over here to the on off, we turn to on, then we come down here and we look for the Florida talk group. Ah, there it is right there. We select it. And because that was talk group number 2 in our call list, that's the value that shows up. If we want to save that, we simply click OK. And now our RX group is on, and we have one talk group in that list. Let's go to something, though, that's a little more exquisite and complex. So we're going to edit the RX group for West Central Florida 1, our tactical talk group. Now, if you'll remember a moment ago, we said that the Florida talk group 1200 had a value in the call list of 2. Then we also have a second entry here, which is number 18, which is WCF1. So when our radio is tuned to any of the memory channels in the WCF1 zone, we're always going to listen for talk group ID 1230, because that's the base foundation there. But at the same time, even though we're working in a small tactical talk group, 1230, maybe it's small by virtue of the number or small by virtue of the repeater or number of repeaters that are supporting it or area that it covers. We also want to make sure that we don't miss any important calls from Bill over at Command Central, who's on talk group 1200, because he's got 4 of these tactical talk groups that he needs to be able to communicate with on a moment's notice. So what this will do, instead of having to put our radio into a scan, anytime a transmission on talk group 1200 is transmitted on that repeater or on that frequency, you will automatically hear it. You won't be able to respond to it without changing channels, but it will get your attention. Let me give you a very practical example of how this is being used at another locale. I help manage an entity that has 20 different repeaters. Safety is important. In fact, it's the top of the list. If there is a safety-related incident at any one of those 20 locations, the people at the location involved obviously are there to manage the situation, but there's also the possibility that whatever is going on at that location has an impact on other locations that are in its immediate area. So let's say somebody walked in the door with a gun. Probably have nothing good in mind. So immediately you're going to put that facility on lockdown. But the other thing that you want to do, if you've got 3 other facilities that are nearby, you want to let them know immediately that you're in a lockdown status. You have an incident. In the case of how this particular entity's repeater system is set up, an officer, a security officer, or another person in high management can simply turn their radio from channel 1, which is their local talk group, to another channel that has a talk group on a network, because remember, we've got 20, they're all networked together. They turn to that channel, press push to talk, and they can immediately notify those other 3 or 4 or 5 entities that they have an incident. This may affect you. And it works. That's where RX Group comes into mind and comes into play. And it is very, very effective. So this is how you program RX Group. And you do this before you ever start programming your memory channels. You don't have to, but since you're already here in the zone operation, why not? Okay. Now, over here on the far right-hand side, we have something that's called capacity and use. The F2100 has up to 128 memory channels that can be programmed. And you can slice and dice them based on whatever your needs per zone. Maybe some zones has 16 channels, maybe a zone only has 2 channels or 1 channel. Again, that's up to you as the programmer. In this case, we're going to need 11 channels. And because some of what we're doing here with this particular programming profile is defined by what we do in zone 1, figuring out how many channels we need in 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 becomes second nature. So we have a capacity of 11, and we have 11 used. And if we had 16 in our zone, that would mean we have some additional room. You can always change this, by the way. You can always expand it, or you can always contract it. All right, so we're done here. We're going to go to our first zone, which is Florida. And oh, by the way, one other key point. When you first open all of this up, only zone 1 has any channels in terms of the capacity defined. And so even though you may have put in a lot of information defining your zones, unless you go over and actually put a real number, something greater than 0 into that capacity, you won't see your actual zone displayed there in the left-hand list, and you won't be able to go in and do anything with it because you can't see it. So if nothing else, when you're working and you're starting out, make sure that you have at least 1 channel for each zone that you've created. Otherwise, you're going to have to go back to the zone operation table and do it as an afterthought. All right, so we have now our Florida list. it would be real easy to think that you start in the left-hand column and you go all the way across to the right. And it doesn't work that way. The way the programming is set up, you put in your receive frequency first. You type that in. It's all free form, no pull down menu for the receive frequency or the transmit frequency. Something to keep in mind is a rule of thumb. We have band plans, and there's a reason why we have band plans, not just for amateur radio, but for many other types of radio as well. In UHF, your receive frequency will always be lower, at least in the state of Florida. If you go to New Jersey, maybe not so much. But in Florida, your receive frequency is always going to be the lower of the two numbers. Your transmit frequency will be the higher of the two numbers, and the band plan for UHF is 5 megahertz. So if your receive frequency is 442.0625, as it is for the Charlotte repeater, your transmit frequency will be 447.0625. Okay. With the second generation NXDN radios, the default channel type will be digital. If it isn't, you will have to change it manually. That is very simple. And if I can find my cursor here, with the Icom radios, you have 4 options. You have analog, you have mixed analog, mixed digital, and digital. What's the difference? Well, the analog and the digital are kind of self-explanatory, and they're absolute. If you program that memory channel for analog, that's all you're going to transmit, and that's all you're going to receive. If you program that memory channel for digital only, that's all you're going to transmit, that's all you're going to receive. But these radios have the capability in a mixed environment to receive both analog and digital signaling. And if you're programmed in mixed analog, that means I can receive everything, but if I'm going to originate the call, it will be in analog mode. If I've chosen mixed digital, again, it means I receive everything. I'm greedy. I want to have it all. But it also means that if I originate the call from scratch, it's going to be in NXDN digital mode. Anybody see a problem here? A challenge? What happens if I have my radio programmed in mixed digital, but the call comes in analog? You just said if you originate a call, you're going to do it in digital mode. That analog radio isn't going to be able to understand digital. Here's the magic. Elsewhere in the code plug, there is the ability to turn on something that's called talkback, and you can give it a time value. So if somebody calls you in analog mode and your memory channel that you receive that call on is mixed digital, whatever that time value is in the talkback, maybe it's 6 seconds, 8 seconds, 10 seconds, you have that amount of time to respond to that call without having to do anything other than push to talk. Because your radio knows that it received an analog call. So within that window of talkback, you have the ability to automatically respond to that call in analog mode, in the mode it was received. Same thing holds true with the mixed analog. If somebody calls you in digital mode and your memory channel's programmed for mixed analog, if you respond or talk back in that time frame, you will respond in digital mode. This is very useful for entities that have a mixed group of radios and they're trying to make the transition from analog to digital, or maybe vice versa. But once you've heard digital audio, why would you want to go back to analog, right?
That time frame adjustable.
It's variable and it's user defined.
Yeah.
So in your case, you may say, well, I'm Quick Draw Johnson here. I jump on things within 1 second. So I don't need to program more than 4 seconds into my talkback. On the other hand, maybe Dave back there is going, I'm more of a laid back kind of guy. I'll leave it percolate there for a few seconds. Dave puts in a value of 8. It's all user definable. And I'll show you where you can do that in just a moment. All right, so we have defined a channel here. It is digital. And oh, by the way, when you're doing repeaters, remember that you always put the repeater output frequency in the receive column. And the repeater input frequency is your transmit. And if any of you ever decide that you're going to program a repeater, try and keep it all straight in the head, because there it's just the opposite. Okay. All right. So now, because we're in digital, we don't have to worry about C tones or CTCSS tones for receive or transmit. But when we look at the RAN column, we definitely want to have a number in there. Well, here in Florida, in amateur radio, we sort of early on said, let's just use the default of 1. There's no magic to it. We could have said, let's use 21. But amateur repeaters, for the most part, and at least as far as the NI4CE system is concerned, are programmed to use RAN 1. Don't need to get any more complicated. Let's talk about your transmit RF power. You've got 3 options: low 1, low 2, and high. By default, the program says I'm always going to program in high. So if you want anything less than the full output possible with the radio, in this case 5 watts, you've got to take the initiative. High equals 5 watts. L2, which is intermediate, is 2 watts, which leaves L1 for 1 watt. Yes. Remember, L1 is always going to be 1, L2 is always going to be 2, and high is whenever I get up. Now, if you're programming a mobile, Icom's mobiles are standardized at 5, 25, and 45 for UHF. VHF is 5, 25, and 50. Okay, so if you didn't want to run any more than 25 watts with a mobile, you would select L2. Now, here's the gotcha. One of the buttons out front here can be programmed to allow you to manually change your power on the fly. Maybe you've got a program for L2, but hey, you're right on top of the repeater, or it's a simplex channel and you don't need the full L2 power to talk to your buddy that's 200 feet away. So you want to drop it to L1. Yeah, you can do that all day. If your base was set up as L2, you can always go down. But what if I want to go up because my buddy is now a mile away and I'm not sure if even 2 watts will get me there? Well, then we've got a problem, because with the manual high-low power adjustment that you can make by pressing a button, you can't go up. Yeah, if you set your memory channel to L2, which is 2 watts, you can only go down. You cannot increase to 5 watts. So with a portable in particular, if you want the flexibility to go up or down, always set your power to high, which will allow you to go to L2 to L1 and then even back to high. With portables, it's a little trickier because frankly, if you can't hit it with 25 watts, you're probably not going to hit it with 45. And you're going to produce a lot of heat with 45. But that is what it is, and that's a whole nother argument. All right. Is there anything else that we need to worry about? Well, the digital profile. Because unless we tell it what digital profile to use, it's going to go, I can't complete this process. So we have to put a number in here. Well, if you recall, when we created our digital profiles, and you notice there's a list of digital profiles right there. So we don't have to memorize everything or scroll it down in a spreadsheet or whatever. We can just look in real time. Well, this says 1, but what is 1? So I come down here and I click. Well, 1 is Florida. Yay, I've got the right one. So we'll close that. And the digital profile column, again, is a list of all of the digital profiles you've created. If you don't remember which one is which, again, you can go to that intermediate window right below your main programming window and discover it. The other thing that I'm going to point out to you, if only because you don't want to get yourself in trouble, for ham operators, we have a list of rules, guardrails, called Part 97. And one of those guardrails inside is 97113, which says encryption is absolutely prohibited by the Federal Communications Commission. Okay, digital encryption is prohibited. It means that we can't hide things necessarily, security by obscurity, but we can't do it electronically. Huh? Well, these radios are capable, no additional charge, by the way, of 15-bit digital encryption. And if perhaps you should accidentally happen to encrypt your transmission and the radio that you're trying to talk with isn't encrypted, they will hear absolutely zilch. Zip, zero, nada. You have to have radios encrypted in order to hear anything. Do not turn encryption on, off, to on. By default off, leave it off. Now, if you were programming a radio, and again, remember these are Part 90 radios, so maybe you just happen to be the member of a CERT team or an areas group that's connected with a homeowners association, and they have an NXDN repeater, and you want to have their NXDN frequencies in one of your zones, and oh, by the way, they can use encryption. Well, that's where you would turn it on. Then will also require an encryption key, which you get to create. That's further down inside the program. All right, so we've created just about, and I got to find my mouse cursor here because it's not cooperating with. We've done just about everything so far for this memory channel, except give it a name. And if we don't give it a name, what will happen is it will show up on the display as channel 1. If it's in that first position, that's just the default. But we want to give it something that has some meaning. So in this case, because it is in the Florida zone and it's the Charlotte repeater, And we got to do everything we're going to do in 8 characters because that's the limitation of our display. Either that or every time we go to it, it will start scrolling to FL-CHAR. And when you see that on your radio, that means that you have tuned to the memory channel for the NI4CE Charlotte County repeater. The reason we put the FL in there instead of extending the word Charlotte to make it a little plainer is because we've got 8 different zones, and you'll see here in just a moment why that FL is really important. We have a whole bunch of other channels that we've defined in this zone. In fact, all of the NXDN repeaters that are part of the NI4CE system. Yay, that means that when we're in this zone, we will always be on talk group 1200, no matter which repeater we have selected. But I don't want to be on talk group 1200. I want to be in WCF2, one of the tactical talk groups. All right. So we're going to go to WCF2 over here in the right-hand column, or I should say the left-hand column. We'll just click on it. Gosh, that looks an awful lot like what we just saw in Florida, right? Same list of repeaters. And in the text section, notice instead of an FL, there's a number 2. Why did we do that? To keep ourselves from going batty. Because again, we've got the same repeaters in multiple locations, and I want to make sure that I'm in the location that I want to be in, not some other location. So, and again, here's one of those shortcuts. We created the Florida zone first. Got all of the settings right, except digital profile and the text information. But we got the important stuff right the first time. One of the neat things you can do to save a lot of time and prevent mistakes is click on the very first item, and then we're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom, and we're going to press our shift key, press the left mouse button, everything is highlighted, and then we can press the right mouse button and then copy. Yay! We only have to create our list once. We can then go to the next zone, go to the first line, pardon me, and do the right click and paste. And you can do this either for the entire list or for only a portion of the list. It's up to you. But this is one great way if you're going to have a radio profile that's got multiple zones with similar information to create it and hopefully prevent making a lot of mistakes. Because you don't have to key it all in. Now, if you do this, there are 2 things you need to change. Because remember, if you copied the Florida zone and you're going to create a WCF2 zone, you're going to have to change the text information accordingly. And you're also going to have to change the digital profile. Because we're not going to want to use the same talk group and the same digital profile that defines that talk group in this zone. That is relatively easy and not very time consuming to do. Anybody have any questions so far? Yes, Jim.
Have a direct one. I don't show have transmit frequency that have character in it. Your direct one right there?
Check number 3-9. That's an example.
Oh, you mean the direct one, the direct two, direct, okay, let me talk about what that is. Okay. Well, notice that there is a frequency in the receive zone, and then in the transmit zone, there's the arrow that points back to it. That is a simplex frequency. So in other words, you're going to send and receive on whatever the frequency is defined in the receive zone. Okay, and because there is no need to retype it a second time, Icom just automatically, once you put a frequency in the receive zone, by default, it will say this is a simplex row. Okay? And we have defined 3 simplex frequencies, as you see there, that are used in all of the zones. And they're defined so that if somebody says, hey, go to direct 1, you don't have to go searching all over your radio to find it. It's already in the zone that you're in. And we'll work accordingly. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, the same thing. Transmit, what's the options there?
Okay. For the well, RAN, again, you could have a split RAN, just like you could have a split PL tone. Great example of this, Florida Forest Service has a number of repeaters around the state, but because of different groups that go in, they may have the same output tone, but they have different input tones. Here, we could say, well, all right, we want to make this as difficult as possible because there's some, whack job out there that is trying to jam our repeater or what have you. So we're going to use RAN 1 as an input, but we're going to put out RAN 4 or RAN 24 or RAN 44. You can use a split RAN just like you can use split PL. If you're going to use the same RAN code in and out, you just type it in the receive. And the programming automatically assumes, by virtue of that left pointing arrow, that that's also going to be the transmit. Yes?
Is there a way to not encode and be able to hear everything?
Yes. Instead of, and let's go back, I'll show you where that is. Up here in zone operation, notice we have a squelch type, and we selected selective because selective does 2 filtering. It filters for the RAN code first, and then it filters for a talk group or an individual ID. Now, if you were just going to filter for the RAN code, we don't care what the talk group ID is or whatever. All we want to hear is RAN, which means we want to hear everything. Then you would filter by RAN code only. And if you don't care about RAN codes, talk group IDs, or any of that messy stuff, then just leave your squelch off. It's essentially core squelch. In other words, if the repeater transmits, I want to hear it. But that's done in the zone. That used to be done by channel in the first generation radios. And I don't know, somebody figured that's too much work or something. So it's done by zone now. Back to selective. Want to show you a couple of other things that are really, really important. Here under digital conventional, we have own ID. That means your ID, my ID. This is how I want my radio to be identified. And notice that we have a number of 4644. That just happens to be one of the IDs that is used here in West Central Florida by a particular operator. This is where you define the identity of your radio. There is one other location where you define your radio on the air. And it's down here under digital and option. And you'll notice there's a section here, the second section, called over the air alias. You can turn this on or off. You don't have to use it. But if you always want your call sign transmitted every time you press push to talk, there's where you put your call sign. And that way, every time you press push to talk, your call sign will be legally transmitted and be recognized by the FCC as a legal call sign transmission. So remember that, and you will have to turn that on because it's by default off. Type in your text information and you're good to go. There's one other place where you may want to put your call sign or your name. Down here near the bottom of our list, there's something called user interface. There. And under user interface, there's a first category called key assignment. And under key assignment, there are two options. The first one, key, which we'll come back to in a second, but there's another one called display. So when you first turn your radio on, you may want to have your call sign or your name visible on the display so that you know who you are and that you got the right radio. There's where you would put it in. It is an 8-character display for the 2100s. For the 4400s, it's a 14-character display. You have a little more latitude to get creative. And the same thing with OTAA. If you want to center it and your call sign is 6 characters, here's how you get it done. Space, call sign, because you're putting 6 characters into an 8-character space. So if the first character is a space character, your call sign will be centered in your display. Not absolutely necessary, but if you're a neat freak like I am, hey, let's keep it nice, neat, and orderly. Okay. One other thing I'm going to point out here. In this particular item, the very last item says, oh gosh, what is scroll? Is that like a timeout or something? No, it's not really. But for this, probably not a big deal. But for maybe a couple of other functions, that is a big deal. And again, with the 2100 and now also with the new 6130, they have an 8-character display. So if you've got something to say digitally that is longer than 8 characters, that means that the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, the 12th character will scroll out every 1 second. Now, let's just hypothetically say that you're sending a message and you want to program a message into your radio in the message list that says severe weather alert. And you don't want it scrolling across your screen. Well, again, you've got a box of 8 characters. So you got 8, you got another 8, you've got another 8. Okay, the word severe is a 6-character word. So you go space, severe, space, weather. How many characters? 7. So what you may do is you may go space, severe, space, space, weather, and then alert is 5 characters. And then you go space, space, alert. How that will display is every 1 second, instead of things scrolling across the screen, driving you absolutely crazy, it'll go severe weather alert with each word appearing at a 1 second interval. There's a little programming tip. And by the way, when we release NXDN message for Icom, which is our text messaging program where you can actually text message using keyboard and your radio, computer keyboard, we've built a filter in for that 8-character display that will automatically adjust your message to display that way. It's pretty cool. All right. We talked about key assignments. It's not these kind of keys. It's these kind of keys on the front of your radio. These are what are called soft keys. And what's a soft key? It's a button that you can program. You can tell it to do whatever you want within limits. You might tell, as an example, button P0 that you want it to be priority 1 or priority A. What's priority A? Well, when you were programming your memory channels, the very first column said ATR on it. No, that's not the make of an airplane. It's short for attribute. And I'm going to go back just to show you what we're talking about here. Well, let's say, in fact, it should already be here, but it wasn't for this. So I'm going to put one in there. Let's say that I want to make Florida Boyette memory channel my priority A, which means that if I program the radio to always, upon power up or reset, to go to that channel and that channel only, first time, every time, do not collect O or get $200, it'll go to priority A. I can also assign that to any one of these 4 buttons. So that if I want to go from wherever I'm at in my radio to that precise channel, all I do is press the button, the radio does the rest. You can do that for priority A, priority B. In fact, let me pull down the menu here to show you what we've got. Those are the options. Priority A, priority B, or an emergency channel. And you can give any one of these memory channels all 3 attributes if you want, but that would be maybe a waste of attributes, so decide accordingly. In the case of how I have my radio programmed, I have Boyette as priority A, Florida Boyette. I have WCF1 Boyette as priority B. So I'm part of a tactical team that's working in Hillsborough County, which would use the Boyette repeater. So I can go from Florida Boyette talk group to the WCF1 talk group just by pressing a button. And if I need to go back to Florida, all I do is go back to button P0. One of the buttons you're going to want to assign, if you've got more than one zone, is a way to navigate the zones. Because your channel change announcement or channel change button here on the top is going to allow you to change channels within the zone. So we're going to go back to the keys here. And notice that P0 is priority A, P1 is priority B, P2 is zoned down. So if I keep pressing P2, it will take me eventually through all of the zones. And it will show me the name of the zone as I go through them. That way I can land on the right zone. Finally, P3 is a really useful tool. Isn't that right, Dave? P3 is called user set mode. And we'll show you the set mode options here in just a second. But among the features of user set mode is the ability to see how strong the incoming signal is. It will give you RSSI, and it can also show you what the bit error rate of any incoming transmission is. Extremely useful as a diagnostics tool. So that's why we programmed P3 as user set mode. Come back to that in just a second. The up and down. On the side of the radio here, we've got two little buttons right below the PTT. Those are your up and down. So in addition to your channel change, you can also use these two buttons to go channel up, channel down. Or if you were looking in that list of individual users when you want to make the individual call, that's how you would navigate and scroll through that list. And finally, these radios are all equipped with a little red button. That's your emergency button. By default, it will be programmed for emergency, which sets off a whole lot of bells and whistles and noise, and also sends out an emergency message if you're operating in digital mode. And Jim, for your F6400, it'll also send out your GPS location. Way cool. Okay. Now, we talked about user set mode. So I'm going to go down here, and under channel group, there's an item called, or the next one down is called user set mode. This is going to be the last feature we're going to show you this afternoon because we're rapidly running out of time. This is a list of features and functions that you need to set up. There are some default values there, and in that right-hand column where it says SEL, by default, most of that will be on. A couple of them are off, but you can see we've made some changes. So where it says backlight, these radios have a backlight for the display. Dim auto, which is the setting, basically says whenever this radio receives something, or if you transmit, the backlight comes on for 5 seconds, and then it automatically goes off. What does that accomplish? Well, it enables you to see the important information in a timely manner, but then it also saves your battery. If you leave it on all the time, you will get diminished battery lifetime. Beep, and this thing goes beep, beep. So you can choose to either leave it on or off. Ringer level. What is a ringer level? Well, if you happen to get a call alert, which is effectively like a digital page, or you get a message, yeah, it can land on your radio just like it lands on your cell phone, but hey, it could be the world's best kept secret unless somebody tells you it's there. Hence, you set your ringer level. Now, you can make that an absolute of 1 through 5, with 1 being the quietest, 5 being the loudest, or you can make it a variable 1 through 5 and tie it to wherever the volume is on your volume knob. So if you don't always want it to be beep or beep, 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 but you want it to be beep, 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 do a 4 or 5 linked. And then it's tied to whatever you have your volume set at for the rest of your radio. Same thing with the beep level. Now notice on squelch and on mic gain, in the select column, we've said on. Why? Because sometimes you want to set your squelch a little bit higher, or you may want to set it a little bit lower. This will allow you to do that. Some cases, you may want to set your mic gain a little bit higher, particularly if you're in a noisy area. In other cases, you may want to set it to a lower area if you're in a relatively quiet area. This will allow you to make those adjustments. Now, how do you make those adjustments? Remember our P3 user set mode? Well, you press and hold that P3 button for about a second, and up will pop the first option. In this case, it's backlight. All right. So you don't need to make an adjustment to your backlight. So you just press the button again quickly to the next option, which in this case will be squelch level. If you want to increase your squelch, then come up here to your channel knob or to your side buttons. Your squelch options are 0 to 9, with 0 being no squelch and 9 being the highest squelch level threshold that you can have. Again, same thing with the mic gain. Okay. A couple of other quick things. Notice that on battery voltage, the left-hand column says on, but the right-hand column says off. Here's why. When you turn your radio on, you want to know how much battery life you've got. So one of the things that will display is your battery voltage. Most fully charged batteries will be in the range of 8.2 to 8.5 volts. And with that full battery, you're going to get 5 watts. After some period of time, either just sitting here minding its own business, listening for the next piece of traffic, or you're transmitting, that battery voltage is going to go down. When it gets down into the high 6s, time to start thinking about maybe I want to find a battery charger, or I want to maybe change out my battery for a backup battery. When it gets down to around 6.4, it's called, I need to find a battery charger. Because at that point, the radio is about to go dead. As the battery voltage goes down, your output power also proportionally goes down. Keep in mind, normal operation, as I'm sure you've all heard at one time or another, battery life cycles are figured based on 90% listening, 10% transmitting. If you talk a lot and transmit a lot, your battery is going to deplete a lot faster. So it's that 90-10 rule that battery life is kind of figured on. Finally, the very last item, system info. System info needs to be on if you want to be able to measure RSSI and BER. In other words, signal strength and bit error rate. By default, it's off. You need to turn that on. No matter what radio you've got, 2100, 1100, 4400, the new F6130D, all has this laid out, the same features, same manner. So what you've seen here on the F2100 works in all those radios as well. And By opening some of this up, we're giving you, the end user, the latitude to make some fine tuning adjustments. While you can't directly program frequencies into the radio, I think you would have to have a computer anyhow to do it because there's just too many options. But this will allow you to do some simple stuff that can make a huge difference in the quality of your transmission. If your mic gain is set too low, people are going to keep turning the radios up, and then the next transmission, they're going to have to turn them back down. Matter of coming up with the right value. And some people tell me that mine should actually be 0.1 instead of 1 as a maximum value, just because of my ability to project. So I hope you have found this interesting. I apologize to whoever was supposed to be following me because I ran way over time, but these are the kinds of things that you're going to need to know if you want to program one of these radios and get the most out of it. And with all of the stuff that we have put into what you've seen here, this is part of a standardized programming profile that we will now begin distributing to Aries folks, Skywarn folks, anybody who wants it with an NXDN radio, so that when the next emergency hits and our section emergency coordinator says Hillsborough County needs to go to WCF2, you're going to know what it is and how to get there. So thank you all. Yes.